Today we're going to be recapping a great interview of Christopher Mellon on the Joe Rogan Experience. So let's start the video. Now, before we start, I just want to say that the purpose of this video is to give you a quick recap of Chris Mellon's interview in case you don't have the time to watch the entire thing or simply don't want to listen to the whole 3-hour interview. But I still highly encourage you to check out the Joe Rogan Experience on Spotify because I believe the interview is pretty important to ufology in general. And also, a disclaimer, I won't be able to show you super lengthy parts of this interview so I don't get in trouble. But I'll basically give you bullet points on the interview so you have a good idea of what was said. So let's begin. Christopher Mellon spent 20 years working for the government. He worked in the Senate, for the Intel Committee, and for Senator Cohen. Once Senator Cohen became Secretary of Defense and went to the Pentagon, he took Chris with him. Christopher then served 4 years for the Defense Department. After Clinton departed, he was asked to stay on and work under Secretary Rumsfeld. He goes into talking how his interest in UFOs began, and here's what he says.
Early age, I was 7 years old at a boarding school, and the principal of the school, a friend of his, had photographed video, an old reel-to-reel Kodak movie camera, had taken a home movie of a video of a UFO flying in beautiful blue skies, cumulus clouds, huge golden disc that comes into the picture and banks, goes into a cloud, and it disappears into this sort of wispy cloud in a way that would be very, very hard, I think, to fake somehow, particularly in those days with no computer-generated imagery. And it comes out the other side and then sort of goes off over the horizon. And I was, stunned and flabbergasted, and myself and all the other kids ran outside that night and were looking at the stars, and it just sparked my curiosity, a lifelong curiosity.
He then goes on to talk about how he shied away from asking about the subject of UFOs because of the stigma attached to the subject. He goes into a story about how he talked to somebody from the Maui Space Optical Tracking Facility and asked them if they ever tracked anything strange, and actually obtained some tape of things recorded doing some strange stuff. This footage was actually featured on national TV, but he says nothing really came of it. He says that people kind of just threw their hands up in the air and let the story pass. He goes into the story in detail, and you can check it out in the episode. Mellon then goes into the story of an astronaut that asked President Clinton to investigate some recordings that astronauts saw of UFOs up in space, recording that supposedly existed. But when Christopher tried to go further, he really got nowhere with the request. They go into talking a little bit about Project Blue Book. They go on to talk about why the Navy videos that we're used to seeing these days didn't immediately go up to the Pentagon. Here's a clip.
There wasn't a mandate to go look for it. There wasn't a department that was designed to seek these things out. I mean, what was the reason why it wasn't getting all the way to the Pentagon?
Well, specifically in the case of the Navy in 2016, just today, I believe, or yesterday, DOD announced that they're going to do an IG investigation of this incident, of this phenomenon.
What's IG mean?
Issue. The Inspector General.
Okay.
Sorry. So there's going to be an internal investigation at DOD of how they handled this UFO issue. And I believe it's not clear yet. They just made this announcement, and their motives and what sparked this are still a little bit uncertain. But it appears they're going to focus on this issue of how did this fall through the cracks for years? How is it that these guys are flying around, seeing this stuff, it's on the radar, and nobody up the chain of command is being notified? Policymakers, the Secretary of Defense himself, Congress, etc. It was just going into the ether. I mean, there was no effort made to get support to any of those guys, and that's when I, kind of threw the bullshit flag and said, this is unacceptable. And so that's when I started jumping into this.
Do you think it was because of the stigma that's attached to the subject that they just didn't bother bringing it to their superiors?
Absolutely, yeah.
The interview then goes on to talk about Commander Fravor's incident in detail and why it's such an important sighting. It's a great conversation.
It had information as to where they were traveling to. Mm-hmm. Extraordinary capability, went from 80,000 feet above sea level to 1 in less than a second. They have no idea what it is, what it does. And then the people on the Nimitz were saying they had been seeing these things.
Correct, and on the Princeton. And when Dave and the other F-18 landed, there was no interest on the part of the intelligence officers of doing anything really other than but ridiculing them.
Yeah.
So they came out, with tin hats on and foil hats, and they were playing Men in Black song or something.
Yeah.
But that case was phenomenal because there were so many witnesses and so many different sensor systems that were verifying independently the visual reporting. So there were multiple radars, there were infrared systems, perfect viewing conditions, broad daylight, middle of the afternoon, multiple aircraft, and all of the data agrees that these craft are doing things that we thought were impossible.
Afterwards, they talk a little bit about Elon Musk. Then they talk about Jeremy Corbell's recent photo releases.
Drone, like the most recent video, the pyramid-shaped objects that are flying around. Like you've seen that, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
What was your take on those things?
I want to see the rest of the data. They've got radar data on that. And from the radar data, they should be able to gain some real insights as to where these things are coming from and going to, trajectories, speeds, all that kind of thing.
That hasn't been released, right?
That has not been released. They're still analyzing that. I don't think that they will comment publicly on that, unfortunately. But they do have that information and other information. So we should be able to gain some insights. It's entirely possible that they are drones. Tyler Rogaway is a brilliant analyst of aviation issues who works for the War Zone. Has written a very lengthy piece making that assertion. Could be right. I'm a little skeptical, but we'll see. That's why we need more data.
They go on to talk about AI and how UAPs might be actually probes coming from other civilizations. And also how they could actually be ultra-terrestrial, in this case meaning coming from under the ocean. They talk about the pyramid UFOs, and here's what he has to say about that.
I'm a little skeptical, but we'll see. That's why we need more data.
What do you say?
Well, the duration of flight was far longer than drones routinely can.
What was the duration?
Perform. Hours. So typically, if it's an electric drone, it has a very short flight time. These ships were 100 miles off the coast in conditions of low visibility. And so whoever was operating these things was traversing a long distance probably. There were only a few other ships in the area, and they know what those ships were, and they deny that they were operating these craft. So they were in the air a long time. They were very rigorous in the manner in which they operated as a unit. They clearly intended to get our attention. They were operating in a manner that suggests they were trying to provoke our air defense systems.
Then they talk a little bit about the UFO incidents that have happened over nuclear bases. They also talk about the Phoenix Lights.
The Phoenix case, what I find most intriguing about that, one of the things, is that Fife Symington, the governor of Arizona, who's a former Air Force officer, himself said after the fact he saw this thing, and it was not a plane, it was not flares, as some in the Air Force contended.
And other mass UFO events like the Zimbabwe case, and they briefly talk about the Australian school case. Chris then goes on to talk about the gimbal video, and here's a little bit of that.
The one where it's rotating?
Yeah.
That's gimbal, yeah. What's really also interesting about gimbal is that off the screen, there's a formation of UFOs flying towards the gimbal and the Navy aircraft that are there. And when you hear the one guy remark, one of the pilots, he says, "Look, dude, there's a whole fleet of them out there." That's what he's referring to.
Wow.
There was a V-shaped formation of these objects approaching the gimbal, which then veered away and flew off. And they don't have any idea what those were.
They also talk about why the video was released, which is pretty interesting. Joe and Chris then talk about how they could map the ocean. Then they move on to Area 51 and what he thinks of Bob Lazar. Here's a little snippet of what Christopher thinks.
I found his explanations curious.
Yeah. How so?
The complexity of it and the fact that he talked about Laurentium, for example, and then decades later it turns out that apparently there is a more stable form of that than...
That's element 115?
Sounds right. I couldn't tell you for
But
sure.
it's called Laurentium.
Laurentium. I'm a little skeptical about his claims, I have to say. A friend of mine claims to know the gal who was his supervisor when he worked out there, and knows what he was actually doing and where he was located. And claims that he was a guy who checked radiation on badges.
That's it.
Yeah.
After that, they talk about Travis Walton.
Yeah, I had the pleasure of meeting him once with two of my boys, and listened to his story and read the book and so forth. And it seems credible. You know, as incredible as it is, he was missing for those 5 days. No one's ever found any explanation of where he was. There was a full manhunt going on. There were like 6 or 7 other guys who saw the UFOs, saw this beam strike him. He's told the same story for years. It's, you know, I asked him a couple of questions, and he gave quick, rapid answers. Of course, he's been telling this story for a long time, but he didn't sound like someone who had to pause and, you know, try to, what am I going to say with this, you know?
Then they talk about the abduction phenomenon, including Betty and Barney Hill, and even John Mack's study on the whole phenomena. Then they get off topic, talking about Chris's encounter with a grizzly bear.
Never heard anything like it. I wish we had it on a recording somewhere, because it's not like what I've ever seen in a video or heard anywhere else. It was the epitome of ferocity, you know? And so this thing starts charging up at us. We're up on a trail, on a hiking trail, and I just slip off the safety and start getting as much spray out there as I can. And it comes up on the trail and stops and looks at us, and he puts his head down, and like he's gauging us. And I'm just standing there putting the spray out with the sensitivity they have. I'm sure he was, you know, getting that. Although he was about 30 feet away, kind of at that point, about the
30
limit.
feet away.
Yeah, he was right there. He was.
Oh my God.
I think if it had been a female bear with cubs, I'm not sure that would have worked.
They go on to talk about that UFOs might be alien or maybe belong to China or Russia, and what the best case scenario would be.
And
That would be the worst. That'd be worst case
yeah,
scenario.
we monitor the Chinese and Russians very closely, very carefully. We spend, I think the unclassified figure is about $70 billion per year on the intelligence program, intelligence community. And it would be very surprising and it's stunning if they had independently developed technology that was that far ahead of everything else and everyone else, somehow secretly. So it doesn't seem likely, and we don't think that's the case.
So more likely
something
ultra-terrestrial
else.
or extraterrestrial.
They talk a little bit about Bob Lazar's claims that we have in our possession UFO craft. They talk about Roswell, and also where the government could hide UFOs. Then they move on to talk about presidents and how much access they actually have to UFO files. Here's a bit of that.
They don't have access to anything close to all the information, and they don't need it, and they don't want it. You know, most of the secret stuff is not sexy or interesting or particularly, you know,
Isn't that a
noteworthy.
flaw, though, in our system? I mean, if that's really legitimately the commander-in-chief. That's the commander-in-chief of the greatest army the world's ever known, but you can't know a lot of shit.
It's not that he can't, and he can get briefed anything he wants, but he would spend he could spend the first 6 months doing nothing but looking at secret programs and getting briefed on them. And it's just not worth his time.
Christopher then tells a story about a nuclear weapons scare that's pretty interesting and involves New York. They talk a little bit about Avi Loeb. They talk a little bit about cases in other countries.
Or video that was taken over Mexico City, wasn't there something?
There is an interesting one for the Mexican military. Don't know much detail about that. I've seen it. There have been a lot of sightings in Mexico and in South America. The Brazilians have tons of video. I haven't seen much of it. I know that they've collected a great deal of information. They've had some incidents like we did in '52 where the capital of the U.S. was being overflown. So there is some other video evidence out there for sure. There's some video that we haven't released that we have that I've seen.
What have you seen?
One of them, I've seen a few of them, and until the Defense Department releases it, I can't say too much about it.
Then they go a little bit into Mick West.
his debunkings are more elaborate than alien theories. You know, he's got civilian airliners on their sides without transponders and restricted airspace with 3 other things happening at the same time. But
his take on the Tic Tac is pretty silly.
Yeah, he doesn't. What bothers
he doesn't take
me
into
most
account all
is
the evidence.
He has no regard for military personnel and their experience with these sensors and these aircraft and what they're seeing and reporting. He
and the
just
tracking systems.
Discounts these people, and
Yeah.
he's never been in one of these planes. He's never operated these sensors, and he just dismisses these people, and that bothers me.
Chris and Joe go over the Go Fast videos, and then Chris goes on to talk about incidents that haven't been released yet. Here, check that out.
What video that you've seen is the most compelling that's been released? And have you seen anything that hasn't been released that's more compelling?
One of the ones that hasn't been released is got more emotional impact, certainly.
Can you give us a tease?
The UFO is going really close to this guy, and he's freaking out for good reason.
They go on to review deeply the Tic Tac FLIR videos and also talk a bit about Chad Underwood, which actually sparked interest for me, and I'll have to look into it later. Here's a clip.
Chad Underwood, I've heard him on a podcast describe that event, and I actually sent it around to some people because he debunks the debunkers. He said he's got thousands of hours of cockpit time, knows those systems, knows those aircraft. He says, that was instantaneous acceleration, no ifs, ands, or buts, and there's no way that was any kind of conventional aircraft out there.
They go on to talk about stories of contact with extraterrestrials that Chris has heard. They talk about Jackie Gleason and Nixon and that famous rumored story about them getting together and looking at alien remains.
Okay, that's not what I was thinking of.
Yeah, he built a house that looked like a UFO inside of it.
They go on to talk a little bit about remote viewing.
What's your take on that remote viewing stuff?
Well, they seem to have some individuals, they claim, who could perform better than chance and could do so consistently. Some of their research has been disputed. So, I don't have a strong feeling, but I do know that some people have had some legitimately crazy experiences.
Chris talks a little bit about Skinwalker Ranch.
It's crazy stuff. And they will look you right in the eye. They're people with PhDs, and they'll say, yeah, this guy came in the room, and we said, what are you doing in here? Because it's a classified, facility. And the guy, big guy with one arm missing in a hook or something, and he wheels, turns around, goes out. The guy who's telling the story runs up and grabs the door and opens it. There's nobody in the hallway.
They talk at length about metallurgy theories and wreckage from UFO crafts. He then talks about international incidents and international attitudes towards UFOs. Towards the end of the interview, he talks about his views and ideas of how government can take steps on how to handle this phenomena. This JRE episode was truly a pleasure to listen to and was very rich with objective, credible information on the modern UFO subject from a highly credible source. I highly recommend you to listen to the whole interview if you're serious about the UFO subject. I think we live in very exciting times for the people like me who have been fascinated with the subject since the 90s. And for this video, I'll leave you with some short, choice words from Christopher Mellon.
There's some strange anomalies going on here in our atmosphere worth our attention.
Till next time, this is Jesse. Hit that subscribe and notification bell so you don't miss any of these episodes because we love the UFOs. Till next time.